This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform. More about them later in this video. Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today we're talking about the Great Dismal Swamp, which was, at one point, a critical part of the Underground Railroad. The script today was provided by Larry Holsworth, and if he's provided socials, they'll be right alongside links to my storytelling channel, Story Rant, and more. But let's dive into it, shall we? Surrounding the waters known as Hampton Roads is one of the most populated areas along the east coast of the United States. The region comprising the cities of Virginia Beach, Norfolk, Newport News, Virginia, and the North Carolina Metropolitan Statistical Area is the home of nearly 2 million people. It is also the home of the largest naval base in the world, several smaller support bases, army facilities, the massive Newport News shipbuilding facility, and the Port of Virginia. The latter offers the deepest water port on the East Coast. In short, the region teems with shipping activity, as well as the trucking and rail industries that form a major portion of American supply chains. This great hub of activity borders to its south one of the nation's largest and most historically significant wetlands. Known as the Great Dismal Swamp, it includes within its boundaries parts of cities including Chesapeake, Virginia, and surrounds Lake Drummond, which sits deep within the heart of the swamp. Somewhat oddly, though waterways are an important part of Virginia's economy and history, there are only two naturally occurring freshwater lakes in the Commonwealth. One is Lake Drummond. The other is Mountain Lake in western Virginia. The two could not offer more dissimilar environments. According to the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, the Great Dismal Swamp once stretched over 1 million square acres. Over the years, reclamation and other human activities have reduced the size of the swamp to less than half of that size, roughly 480,000 acres, or approximately 750 square miles. What remains is an ecological marvel, the home to an extensive catalog of mammalian, reptilian, and amphibian life. It is also a refuge for numerous avian species. Over 100 plant families thrive in the swamp. It was once the northernmost habitat of the American alligator, though in the 21st century sightings of that animal are rare. Birds, however, are not, with over 200 species to be found there at various times of the year. Invasive species are a threat to the swamp, as is human activity in the form of runoff of pesticides, fertilizers, and other pollutants. The Great Dismal Swamp has a rich history as well, having been inhabited by humans for centuries before the arrival of the Europeans. Evidence indicates humans resided in the swamp and exploited its resources for over 13,000 years. It provided a refuge and battleground for indigenous peoples, later a collection of communities for escaped and enslaved peoples, and a place of resort and business opportunities for early Virginia and North Carolina settlers. By the late 1500s, about half a century before the English arrival at Jamestown, the northern regions of the swamp were occupied by the Chesapeacan people, also referred to as the Chesapeake. They spoke an Algonquin dialect and were likely a branch of the Carolina Algonquin tribes, which lived along the southern boundaries of the swamp and along the coast of what became North Carolina. Further north, the Algonquin-speaking tribes formed what is known to history as the Powhatan Confederacy. By 1605, this confederation of more than 30 tribes controlled most of the region and had displaced the Chesapeacan people from the swamp. The Powhatan Confederation was the main tribe encountered by the English settlers in Virginia and the natives featured in the mythical stories regarding John Smith and Pocahontas. As the English settlements in Virginia expanded along the James and York rivers and their tributaries, numerous natives sought refuge from the intruders in the swamp. There, they encountered further pressure from the south and east, from settlers along the coast and rivers of what became North Carolina. By 1650, numerous small settlements existed in the swamp and along the freshwater lake at its center. In 1664, Virginia Governor William Berkeley dispatched William Drummond, then one of the wealthier residents of Jamestown, to establish a government in the hitherto ungoverned settlements south of Virginia, north of the lands controlled by the lords proprietors of the Carolina colony. Drummond became the de facto first governor of what became North Carolina. The following year, Drummond led a surveying and hunting expedition into the swamp. It was during this expedition when the party discovered the freshwater lake in the middle of the swamp, which today bears his name. The party later became lost in the swamp, and Drummond emerged as the only survivor. Suspicious, right? Drummond later became involved in an insurrection which became known as Bacon's Rebellion, an attempt to remove Berkeley as governor of Virginia. The revolt failed and Drummond attempted to escape by fleeing into the swamp. He was found, given a token trial, and hanged near Jamestown in January 1667. His legacy is in the name of the lake at the center of the swamp, named Lake Drummond through common usage rather than by official sanction. By then, although some remaining Powhatan refugees remained in scattered communities within the swamp, the power of the Confederation had been broken. The Virginia and Carolina settlers were already looking at various means of exploiting the swamp, including the timber to be harvested from within its environs. If you want to be as popular as the Dismal Swamp Hotel, then you're going to need a fancy website to get the message out. And today's sponsor, Squarespace, is just what you're looking for. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform perfect for entrepreneurs. Whether you're a wealthy philanthropist looking to market your swanky club or a gift shop owner looking to market your great Dismal Swamp memorabilia, Squarespace has all the tools you need to get the job done, all in one place and on your terms. With Squarespace's next-generation website engine, the Fluid Engine, you'll be able to choose from a template and customize it to your heart's content. And unlike using an expensive web designer, your website will be fully functional on desktop and mobile from the get-go. With Squarespace's guided design system, Squarespace Blueprint, and their brand spanking new AI and SEO tools, you'll be able to pick from a curated list of layout and styling options to ensure you're able to build your brand the way you want from the ground up. And you'll be able to make sure your website hits all of those SEO sweet spots, ensuring you reach the right people to grow your audience. And best of all, if you're looking to sell your great Dismal Swamp memorabilia on your website, Squarespace offers flexible payment options with simple but powerful tools. Accept credit cards, PayPal, and Apple Pay, and in eligible countries, your customers will have the option to buy now and pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. Ready to get started? Check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now, back to the video. In 1728, Virginia Governor William Byrd II led a surveying party into the swamp, intent on establishing a definite border between his colony and the Carolina colony to the south. Born in Virginia but educated in England, Byrd was a prolific writer and kept logs and diaries of his various explorations and expeditions in Virginia. He also possessed a somewhat sarcastic style in his writing, which was reflected in his account of the surveying expedition of 1728, published as the history of the dividing line betwixt Virginia and North Carolina. In it, he mentioned a stream encountered which he dubbed Matrimony Creek. He chose the name according to his writings because of the stream's brawling and turbulent waters. Guess he didn't have a high opinion of marriage. Byrd also regarded the people of North Carolina with dripping contempt. He was, in his own modest assessment, a gentleman and a polite companion. But to Byrd, the people of the North Carolina were not up to his personal standards. To tell the truth, he once wrote, "'Tis through an aversion to labor that makes people file off to North Carolina, where plenty and warm sun confirm them in their disposition to laziness." Byrd's reports were not compliments to the swamp either, which he saw as containing little of value to the Virginians. Byrd's description of the region was that of a miserable morass where nothing can inhabit. He proposed, perhaps tongue-in-cheek, that it be drained using enslaved labor and converted to the growth of hemp, then a highly prized product by the Royal Navy, which had a nearly insatiable demand for ropes and cables. It was Byrd who first referred to the vast swamplands as the Great Dismal Swamp, a name which stuck and began emerging on maps in the mid-1700s. Though Byrd was unimpressed with the swamp's commercial possibilities, to put it lightly, other Virginians were not. In the mid-18th century, the attentions of the colony were directed towards protecting its borders from French and Indian attacks, and its coasts from the trepidations of the French Navy, as well as pirates and privateers from the Caribbean. The wealthy planters of the Tidewater also faced the prospect of working lands that had become nearly exhausted from decades of planting and harvesting of tobacco. A new tract of fertile lands offered great appeal to the planters. These Virginians cast covetous eyes at the swamp. Oh baby. Eager to both exploit its lands and its large stands of virgin timber. The great cypress trees were valuable for shipbuilding, for example, while the stands of cedar offered wood for shakes to be used in the construction of buildings. for both sidings and roofs. After the trees were harvested, the land would be suitable for tobacco production as well as other crops. In 1763, a group of 12 influential Virginians formed a company, which in its Articles of Agreement described themselves as a company for the purpose of taking up and draining a large body of land called the Dismal Swamp. At their head was surveyor, planter, military leader, and politician George Washington. Yes, that George Washington. Washington toured the swamp that year and every subsequent year for the next half-decade, as both a surveyor and investor in the project. Over the ensuing decade, enslaved laborers dug drainage ditches to drain the swamp, and manufactured cedar shingles to sell in order to help fund the project. The irony of George Washington attempting to drain a swamp, viewed 2.5 centuries later, is obvious. The attempt failed, largely because of the lack of experience in the mechanics of draining such a large area. The American Revolution diverted the attention of the members of the company, especially Washington, and the project ground to a halt. In 1785, with independence won, Washington and the company returned to the project. Washington suggested the company hire Dutch artisans and laborers, recognizing their long experience in reclaiming lands from the waters. That suggestion came to naught, and in the early 1790s, a new means of exploiting the swamp was suggested. George Washington's attention was again diverted elsewhere when he was elected as the first president of the United States in 1789. From his offices in New York and later in Philadelphia, he continued to monitor events in the Dismal Swamp, but lacked the time to take an active role. Nonetheless, he financially supported a plan put forth by Patrick Henry to build a canal along the edge of the swamp, connecting Virginia's Hampton Roads and the Chesapeake Bay with Albemarle Sound in North Carolina. Revenues generated by the canal were to be used to help fund the project's goal of draining the majority of the swamp. Construction of the canal began in 1793. By then, Washington had found that his long service to his country, both during the Revolution and as president, had severely depleted his financial resources. Washington had taken no salary for either his military service or as president and founded himself land-rich but cash-poor. In 1795, he sold his interests in the Dismal Swamp Company to his former cavalry commander Henry Light Horse Harry Lee. Being a cheapskate, Lee never apparently paid Washington, and eventually the shares reverted to the by then deceased first president's estate. The canal was a more successful undertaking than the drainage project. Again, and I'll add, unfortunately, enslaved laborers were used, working alongside hired supervisors. The canal was dug by hand. Workers endured the pestilence to be expected along the edge of a major swamp, and malaria and dysentery added to the miseries of the heat, humidity, and hard labor. I wonder if that's mainly just mosquitoes and ticks and all sorts of nasty things. I hate mosquitoes. The 22-mile-long canal was completed in 1805, opening that year. Where it crossed the Virginia-North Carolina border, a hotel was quickly opened, the border dividing its main room. Called the Dismal Swamp Hotel, which is totally marketable, I feel, it quickly became popular with gamblers, conmen, and a preferred spot for duels. The popularity was because of the legal jurisdictions of the day. Someone committing a crime on the North Carolina side could avoid arrest by simply crossing the room to the Virginia side, where North Carolina sheriffs had no authority. The same held true in reverse.
Now I'm in Australia. Now I'm in America. Australia. America.
I get it, Dad.
America.
The Dismal Swamp Hotel made its purpose clear through its advertising, where it announced its willingness to support all purposes of life as eating, drinking, marrying, and dueling. The original Great American pastime, apart from enjoying a good brothel, that is. Am I right? The reference to marrying is explained by North Carolina's far more relaxed laws regarding the holy state of matrimony. Bothersome details such as parental permissions, announcement of banns, which is the tradition of making an official notice in a church for the marriage that will take place, conducted 3 Sundays in a row. Traditions are weird sometimes, what can I tell you? And other issues required by Virginia were ignored in North Carolina. The border between the states has since been moved about 500 feet to the north, and no trace of the hotel remains, other than its mention in various newspapers and other publications. The canal was a financial success and remains in operation in the 21st century, under the control of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers as a section of the Intracoastal Waterway. It is the oldest man-made operating waterway in the United States, primarily used by recreational boaters today. The origin of Lake Drummond, the freshwater lake in the heart of the swamp, remains unknown. There are no rivers or streams to feed it. It has a curious history, much like the Great Dismal Swamp. It sits atop a layer of peat, as does most of the swamp, and is quite shallow, averaging a depth of just over 6 feet. In the 18th century, it was valued as a source of drinking water, especially among seagoing ships. That's somewhat surprising since its water is not clear, but rather a brownish color, similar to iced tea, though not as dark. The bark of the cypress trees that grow within the lake leach their nutrients into the water, as does the peat below, which makes it an inhospitable habitat for the growth of bacteria. The color comes from the high tannin content of the water. In the days of sailing ships, drinking water was usually carried aboard in wooden barrels, and quickly became clogged with bacterial growth. Sailors were usually issued beer or other alcoholic beverages as a substitute for the nearly unpalatable and certainly unhealthy water, which went bad often while a ship was still in port. Because of its unique properties, Lake Drummond water did not turn like freshwater did, even from clear springs, when stored in wooden barrels. Despite its less attractive appearance and its somewhat bitter taste, also a result of the tannins, Lake Drummond's water's then inexplicable ability to resist spoilage was often attributed to supernatural causes, a not uncommon occurrence among sailors of the day. The links between dark and mysterious swamps and the occult are ancient and continue to the present day in folklore, myth, and Lovecraftian horror stories. The coastal regions of Virginia and North Carolina, as is well known, were the sites of large plantations with populations of enslaved peoples prior to the Civil War. To the people who owned and operated the plantations, the enslaved peoples represented nearly as large an investment of capital as the land they worked. To many of the enslaved, it was an intolerable situation, and many fled. Good for them. Much of the history of the antebellum era discusses the slaves that fled to the north via the Underground Railroad across the Ohio River and to freedom. Many who were still uncertain of their safety while within the boundaries of the United States fled all the way to Canada. Yet not all escaping slaves fled to the north. Across the lands which eventually became the Confederacy, large sections of unsettled lands and swamps remained throughout the years preceding the Civil War. The coastal swamps of the South became refuges for fleeing slaves, as they had for the indigenous peoples who sought refuge from the Europeans 2 centuries earlier. Flight into the swamps also offered the possibility of being able to monitor the whereabouts and condition of families still held in slavery. Thousands fled to the swamps in the Louisiana bayous, along the Mississippi, across Georgia and the Carolinas, and in Virginia. The Great Dismal Swamp offered a great amount of sanctuary in Virginia and North Carolina. The swamps impeded pursuit by slave hunters and those dwelling within once they acquired a knowledge of the lay of the land, so to speak. They were at an advantage as they moved through the mires and bogs to safer ground. The swamp also confounded the dogs usually used by fugitive slave hunters, which encountered a variety of odors and other signs which would literally throw them off the scent. The fleeing slaves encountered additional perils from the wildlife that occupied the swamp, toxic plants and toxic reptiles, large mammals such as bears and panthers, and diseases such as malaria. Oh my. But for thousands of slaves across the Southland, such perils were preferred to life in slavery, as you can probably imagine. In the antebellum period, abolitionists developed routes through the swamps to find communities of the former slaves, help conceal them from slave hunters, and provide safe conduct to the north. The Great Dismal Swamp was no exception. By 1860, the year before the Civil War began, thousands of escaped slaves had fled to the Great Dismal Swamp, established communities there, and often intermarried with the remaining indigenous peoples in the region. They and others in similar circumstances across the country were called Maroons, the word likely derived from the French marin, meaning, among other things, fugitive. There is considerable evidence, both anecdotal and archaeological, that workers on the Great Dismal Swamp Canal interacted with Maroons, including free whites and blacks employed by the Dismal Swamp Canal Company. Trade between workers and Maroons included items such as tools, coffee, tobacco, game, and medicines. Newspapers provided to Maroons as evidence that some of the escaped slaves could read, and evidence of letters smuggled via canal workers to the north supports the theory that many Maroons were fully literate. In 1856, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who had published the famed Uncle Tom's Cabin 4 years earlier, told the tale of fictional Maroons in the novel Dread, A Tale of the Great Dismal Swamp swamp. Unlike her earlier work, Dredd told the story of an escaped slave, a maroon, advocating violent resistance to slavery in Virginia. The book, though not as well received as Uncle Tom's Cabin, nonetheless presented graphic descriptions of the long-standing communities of former slaves dwelling in the swamp, self-governed, and in many cases multi-generational, housing both former slaves and those born outside of slavery. Attempts were made by both Virginia and North Carolina authorities to apprehend the Maroons, though with little success. Ha. In 1823, the North Carolina militia entered the swamp, accompanied by dogs in an attempt to capture Maroons. They failed in their mission when most of the targeted communities received advanced warning of their approach and escaped deeper into the swamp. Following the Civil War, many of the remote Maroon communities disbanded. Some had left the area during the war, with many of the young men joining the black regiments organized by the Union Army. As sections of the swamp were drained in the post-war era and into the 20th century, other communities disbanded. Yet there are still some areas within the Great Dismal Swamp peopled by descendants of the Maroon communities, particularly along the Dismal Swamp Canal and along the western border of the swamp in North Carolina. Post-Civil War saw the expansion of lumbering in the swamp, with much of the land reclaimed concurrently. One of the most active timber operations in the swamp was that of the Camp Manufacturing Company of Franklin, Virginia, later Union Camp. The camp operations gradually acquired larger and larger holdings in the area, including shares of the Dismal Swamp Company, formerly purchased by Congress and held by the U.S. government. In 1909, Camp Manufacturing purchased the last shares of the Dismal Swamp Company, which ceased to exist. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, lumbering continued until the last of the virgin forests were removed in the 1950s. Union Camp presented the title of the swamp to the United States Department of the Interior via the Nature Conservancy in 1973. That led to the creation of the Great Dismal Swamp Wildlife Refuge through an act of Congress in 1974. By the time the refuge was created, only about 107,000 acres of wetlands remained of the estimated 2 million acres the swamp once covered. None of the virgin forests remained, though Lake Drummond and its bacteria-free amber-colored water remains at the heart of the swamp. The modern swamp is home to diverse wildlife, including black bear, otters, bobcats, white-tailed deer, weasels, and many others. Nearly 100 species of nesting birds reside in the refuge, and scores more occupy the swamp on a seasonal basis. As a result, it has become a mecca of sorts for birders. The Atlantic Flyway, a path followed by migratory birds along the East Coast, crosses the Great Dismal Swamp. More than 20 breeds of snakes, referred to as danger noodles or nope ropes in my house, call the swamp home. 3 of them poisonous. 2 of these, the copperhead and the cottonmouth, are relatively common along the southeastern coast of the United States. The 3rd, the canebrake rattlesnake, is also fairly common, though its numbers have been dwindling due to the loss of its natural habitats along the east coast. Since the construction of the Dismal Swamp Canal, a feeder canal has connected with Lake Drummond, making the lake the water source for the canal and its locks. It also provides a path for invasive species to reach the lake, but the properties of the lake seems to offer the lake some protection, so, silver linings. It retains only small populations of some game fish. There are occasional sightings of alligators in the swamp, though most are unconfirmed and, if true, are likely either animals that drifted north from the Carolinas or specimens released by former owners who kept them as pets. Who would keep an alligator as a pet? I have no idea. Those people are crazy. As of 2023, there were no reports of pythons, which have invaded swamps further south after their release by former owners, being sighted within the Great Dismal Swamp. Though not yet considered a threat in North Carolina, some have been tracked and captured there. Feral hogs, both escaped domestic pigs and wild boars, are present throughout both the Virginia and North Carolina section of the swamp. The swamp is also home to a growing population of coyotes, wild turkeys, and gray squirrels, all of which may be hunted seasonally under Virginia and North Carolina regulations. The biggest threats to the swamp today are environmental, in the form of chemical runoffs through storm drains, and the negative effects of climate change, of course. Storms of increasing severity have recently ravaged the forests, and toxic chemicals from agricultural applications are found in the waterways. The long-term effect of these toxins on the overall health of the swamp and the species which live within its environs remains one of speculation. The histories of the swamp, the canal, the Maroons, the indigenous people, peoples are represented by sites operated by the National Park Service, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and the state of North Carolina. It is a rich history, one worthy of greater exposure. Like the Great Dismal Swamp itself, it offers diverse areas of interest, many of which are murky and mysterious, yet available for exploration for the intrepid explorer. Well, I certainly hope you found this video to be both entertaining and informative. If you did, be sure to do all that algorithmic jazz and be sure to keep it tuned to Geographics for more videos like this one. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.